was never supposed to win. That's what my mother used to say, smiling like it was a joke. But the way she looked at me, it never felt like one. I grew up in a house where silence was louder than screams, where love wasn't given, it was negotiated. And I learned very early, if you don't control the game, you become the pawn. My name doesn't matter, because by the time this story ends, you'll understand I had to become someone else to survive. I was 19 when my life officially ended, or at least that's what they thought. My mother called me into the living room, her voice soft, too soft. That was the first warning. Sit down, she said. My father didn't look at me, my younger brother scrolling his phone, like I wasn't even there. And then she said it. We've arranged your marriage. No discussion, no consent, just a decision. Signed, sealed, and thrown at me like trash. I smiled. That's the first thing you need to understand about me. When I smile, it means I've already started planning. Who is he? I asked, calm, controlled. My mother's lips curled. He's wealthy. Wealthy. That word, that was her religion. What's the catch? I asked, because there's always a catch. Always. My father finally spoke. He's not well. I tilted my head. Not well, how? Silence. And then my mother leaned forward, whispered like she was telling me a secret. He's in a wheelchair. There it was, the truth, wrapped in shame. But what she didn't know was I wasn't shocked. I was curious. Because people like my mother, they don't make sacrifices. They make deals. So I asked the real question, what do you get? That's when her smile disappeared. And that's when I knew I was right. My father stood up suddenly. Enough questions. This is happening. I nodded slowly, lowered my eyes, played the obedient daughter. But inside, I was already building something. Something quiet, something dangerous. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Power isn't loud, it's patient. And I had just been handed the biggest opportunity of my life. The wedding happened fast, too fast. No friends, no joy, no laughter, just signatures, fake smiles, and a mother who looked relieved, like she had just sold something, and finally got paid. I wore white, but it didn't feel like purity. It felt like surrender. But surrender is the best disguise. That night, I was taken to his house. Huge, cold, empty. The kind of place where secrets echo. They rolled me into the bedroom, him sitting in that wheelchair, silent, watching me. And then the door closed. We were alone. I stood there, still, waiting, because this was the moment where everything could go wrong, or everything could change. He looked at me, long, careful, like he was studying me. And then he spoke. Take off the jewelry. Not what I expected. No emotion, no desire, just a command. I obeyed. One piece at a time, necklace, earrings, bangles, each one hitting the table like a countdown. And then he said something that made my skin crawl, not the dress. I froze. My heart slowed down, not faster, slower, because fear, when it becomes familiar, it stops being loud. And then he leaned forward, his eyes locked onto mine, and said, "Come closer." So I did, step by step, until I was standing right in front of him, close enough to see the tiny scar near his lip, close enough to hear his breathing, steady, controlled. And then he did something impossible. He stood up.
Just like that.
No struggle, no weakness, no hesitation. He stood up and walked. My entire body went cold, but my face didn't change, because reacting is how you lose. He smiled. Good, he said. You didn't panic. That's when I knew this wasn't a marriage. It was a test. And I had just passed the first one. Sit, he said, pointing to the chair. I sat. He walked slowly around me, like a predator, confident, dangerous. You're not like them, he said. Most girls scream. I tilted my head slightly. And what happens to the ones who scream?
He stopped.
And then he smiled. They don't last. Silence filled the room, thick, heavy,
alive.
And then he sat across from me. No wheelchair now. No act. Your parents lied to you, he said. They didn't sell you because I'm disabled. I leaned forward, just slightly. Then why? He looked straight into my eyes, and for the first time, I saw something real. Because they owe me. My heartbeat didn't change, but something inside me shifted. Money? I asked. He laughed softly. No. And then he leaned closer, close enough that his voice dropped into a whisper. Something much worse. That's when I realized I wasn't the victim here. I was leverage. And suddenly, everything made sense. The rushed wedding, the silence, the way my mother couldn't meet my eyes. They weren't giving me away. They were trying to bury something. And I had just been placed right on top of it. So, I said quietly, what exactly did they do? He leaned back, watching me carefully, measuring every reaction, every breath. That, he said, depends on you. I smiled, because now the game had changed. You want something from me? I said, not a question, a fact. He nodded slowly. Smart. And what makes you think I'll help you? He didn't answer immediately, just watched me like he already knew. Because he finally said, you're not loyal to them. Silence. And then I laughed. Not loudly, not emotionally, just enough. You're right. And that was the exact moment everything shifted. Because in that room, between a girl who had nothing and a man who had everything, a deal was born. Not spoken, not written, but understood. And here's what people don't understand about girls like me. We don't break. We adapt. And I had just found something more valuable than freedom, leverage. Tell me everything, I said, and he smiled. But what he told me next changed the way I saw my entire life, my family, my past, even myself. Because the truth wasn't just ugly, it was strategic. And once you see the strategy behind betrayal, you stop being hurt and start becoming dangerous. He opened a drawer, took out a thin file, and slid it across the table toward me. Start reading, he said. I picked it up, slowly, carefully, like it might explode. And in a way, it did. Because the first page had my father's signature. The second page had my mother's, and the third page had my name, but I had never seen it before. My fingers tightened, but my face stayed calm. "What is this?" I asked. He leaned back, watching, waiting. "A contract," he said. My voice dropped, cold, controlled, signed when. He smiled again, that same dangerous smile. "The day you were born." My world didn't shatter, it sharpened. Because pain, when it's too big, doesn't break you, it focuses you. And that's when I realized this wasn't just betrayal. This was planning. Long-term, precise, cruel. And I had just stepped into a game that started before I could speak. I closed the file, looked up at him, and asked the only question that mattered now. "What's my role in all this?" He didn't hesitate. "You're the key." And just like that, I understood something terrifying. I wasn't trapped in this story. I was the center of it. And if I played this right, I wouldn't just survive. I would rewrite everything. But first, I had to learn the rules. And trust me, the rules were darker than anything you're imagining right now. Because what I discovered next about my family, about him, and about myself wasn't just shocking, it was lethal. Because what happened next is where I stopped being a victim and started becoming a problem. I didn't open the file again immediately. That's mistake number one most people make. They react too fast. Instead, I placed it gently on the table, looked at him, and smiled. "Tea?" I asked. He blinked. Just for a second. That was all I needed. Because confusion is the first crack in control. "You just found out your entire life was a contract," he said slowly, "and you're asking for tea?" I stood up calmly, walked past him, into the kitchen like I owned the place. Because here's something people never understand. If you act like you belong somewhere, people start questioning if you actually do. I boiled water, measured leaves, moved slowly, deliberately. Every second stretching, every silence getting heavier. And behind me, I could feel his eyes.
Studying.
Adjusting.
Good.
Let him adjust. By the time I came back, 2 cups in my hands, the power had already shifted a little. I placed one in front of him, sat down, and only then I opened the file again. Page 1. My father's signature, followed by a clause. Primary asset transfer upon maturity. Asset. That word, it didn't hurt. It clarified. Page 2. My mother's signature, under a paragraph titled, Conditional Behavioral Conditioning. I almost smiled, because now everything made sense. Every insult, every comparison, every moment she made me feel small. It wasn't hate. It was training. I turned the page. And then I saw it. My name. Attached to a timeline. A full psychological profile. Fears, triggers, strengths, weaknesses. They knew everything about me before I even knew myself. I closed the file slowly, looked up at him, and asked softly, "Why show me this?" He took a sip of tea, controlled, like this was just another meeting. "Because I need you aware," he said, "not emotional." I nodded. Good answer. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to fight him. Not yet. Because fighting someone powerful too early is how you disappear. Instead, I leaned back, crossed my legs, and smiled. So tell me, I said, what do you really want from me? This time,
He didn't hesitate.
control. Simple.
Honest.
Dangerous. I asked. He looked straight into my eyes and said something that should have terrified me. Everything your parents built. Silence. But inside, something clicked. Because now I understood the real game. This wasn't about revenge. Not just revenge. This was about power transfer. And I was the bridge. So, you want me to betray them? I said. He tilted his head slightly. Wrong word. I raised an eyebrow. What's the right one? He smiled. Realign. I laughed. Soft, controlled. You're good with words. And you're good with masks, he replied instantly. Touché. That's when I leaned forward, lowered my voice, and asked the question that changed everything. What happens if I say no? He didn't answer immediately, just watched me, long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Then he said, You won't. Not confident.
Certain.
And that was interesting. Why? I asked. He leaned closer, voice dropping just enough. Because you already hate them. I didn't react. But inside, that hit something. Because hate is powerful. But awareness of hate, that's control. So I smiled. You're assuming. He shook his head slightly. No, I'm observing. Another silence. And then I made my first real move. I closed the file completely, pushed it back toward him, and said calmly, I'll help you. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded. Because people like him expect outcomes. But then I added, on one condition. Now he smiled. Of course. I leaned in slightly, locked my eyes with his, and said quietly, I don't take orders. The room shifted. Just slightly. But enough. Because now, we weren't controller and asset anymore. We were negotiating. And negotiation is where power gets tested. Then what do you take? He asked. I didn't even blink. Partnership. Silence. And then he laughed. Not mockingly, not arrogantly. Respectfully. You're dangerous, he said. I smiled. You have no idea. And just like that, the deal was sealed. But here's what he didn't realize. I wasn't choosing sides. I was choosing position. Because when two powerful forces collide, the smartest person doesn't stand in the middle. She controls the collision. The next few days, I stayed quiet. Observed, learned, his house, his routines, his people. Because power doesn't live in money, it lives in patterns. And I was mapping everything. Who called him, when, how he responded, what he ignored. And slowly, I started seeing it, the cracks. Because even powerful men have blind spots. And his was trust. Not full trust, but controlled trust. The kind that believes it's always in charge. And that's exactly what I needed. On the third night, he handed me another file.
Thicker. Heavier. Your family, he said.
I opened it. And this time, I didn't hide my reaction. Because what I saw wasn't just betrayal. It was orchestration. Businesses, accounts, hidden transactions, names I didn't recognize. And then a section labeled Subject, Daughter.
Me.
I turned the page, and my breath slowed down, because it wasn't just a profile anymore. It was a plan, a detailed plan on how I would be used, step by step, year by year. Education choices, social circles, marriage timing. Everything was decided before I could even think for myself. I closed the file, but this time my hands were steady, because now I wasn't shocked. I was informed, and informed people are dangerous. They built you, he said quietly, standing behind me now. Perfectly. I didn't turn around. I just said softly,
No.
a pause. And then I looked back at him. They tried. That's when something changed in his eyes, because he realized something important. I wasn't broken by this. I was activated. And that's a very different kind of problem. That night, I didn't sleep. I planned, because now I had everything I needed. Their weaknesses, their expectations, their blind trust in their own system. And I had something they didn't expect, awareness. And here's the most dangerous thing about awareness. Once you see the pattern, you can break it.
Or
You can use it. And I wasn't here to break anything. I was here to take everything. But slowly.
carefully.
Because revenge that happens too fast feels good. But power that builds slowly lasts forever. The next morning, I made my first move. And it was so small, so harmless. No one noticed. Except him. And when he looked at me, there was something new in his eyes. Not control. Not curiosity.
Concern.
Because he finally understood something. He didn't bring me into the game. He unlocked me. And now, even he wasn't safe. Good. Because this is where it stops being a story and starts becoming a war. The next morning, I did something so small, so ordinary. No one questioned it. I called my mother. My voice soft, sweet, almost obedient. Emmy, I miss you. Silence on the other side. Not emotional silence. Suspicious silence. Because people like her, they don't trust love. They only trust control. And right now, she had neither. I was just thinking. I continued gently. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe you were right. That's when she exhaled. Relief. And relief is the easiest emotion to manipulate. I knew you'd understand, she said quickly, too quickly. That told me everything. She needed this more than I did. Can I come home for dinner? I asked softly. A pause. Then, of course.
Hook.
Set.
pulled.
I hung up, turned slowly, and he was standing there, watching, always watching. "You're going back?" he asked. I nodded. Yes. He stepped closer, eyes sharp. "Too soon." I smiled. "That's why it'll work." He didn't reply immediately, just studied me. And for the first time, he didn't look like the one in control.
Good.
Because control is most dangerous when it thinks it's safe. That evening, I walked back into my parents' house. Same walls, same smell, same silence. But I wasn't the same girl. Not even close. My mother hugged me. Too tight. Too long. Not love. Fear. Because she didn't know what I knew. My father stayed seated, watching me like I was a variable he hadn't calculated. My brother barely looked up.
Perfect.
I sat down at the table, smiled, played my role. "Food smells amazing," I said. My mother beamed. Validation. Cheap, but effective. Dinner started quietly. Small talk, fake laughter, careful words. And then I dropped the first stone. "I met his business partner," I said casually. My father froze. Just for a second.
But I saw it.
Because when you're trained your whole life to read people, you don't miss microseconds. "What business?" he asked calmly. I tilted my head, innocent. "Oh, you know." I smiled. "Your business." Silence. Heavy. My mother's hand tightened around her glass. My brother finally looked up.
Good.
Now they were all paying attention. "I didn't know you were involved in offshore accounts," I added softly. And just like that, the temperature in the room changed. My father's voice dropped. "Dangerous." "Who told you that?" I leaned back, sipped water.
Slow.
"Does it matter?" I said. That's when my mother snapped. "Have you been going through things that don't concern you?" she said sharply. There it was. The mask slipping. I smiled again, but this time, it wasn't soft. It was precise. "Everything about me concerns me," I said quietly. Silence. And then I leaned forward, lowered my voice just enough. "You should have taught me that earlier." My father stood up. Angry, but controlled. "Enough games," he said.
Games.
I almost laughed, because now he finally saw it, but too late. "I know about the contract," I said calmly. My mother's glass slipped from her hand, shattered on the floor. That sound, that sharp break, that was the moment their illusion cracked. "What contract?" my father said, but his voice betrayed him.
Fear.
Real fear. I stood up slowly, looked him straight in the eyes, and said the words that changed everything. "The one you signed the day I was born." Silence.
Dead. Cold.
My brother looked confused, lost, like he had just realized he wasn't part of the real story.
Good.
Let him stay lost. My mother's voice trembled. "Where did you?" I cut her off. "It doesn't matter." Because it didn't. What mattered was this. They knew that I knew. And that's where power shifts. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice, trying to regain control. "You don't understand what you're talking about," I smiled. I understand perfectly. Then I leaned in slightly and whispered something only he could hear. He knows everything.
His face changed.
Not anger, not denial, panic. Because now he knew who I meant. And that meant the game had escalated. Leave, he said suddenly.
To me.
But his voice, it wasn't commanding anymore. It was defensive. I picked up my bag slowly, unbothered. And just before I walked out, I turned back, looked at all of them, and said softly, "You should have loved me instead of studying me." Then I left. No drama, no tears, just silence. Because silence is louder when it follows truth. When I got back, he was waiting. Of course he was. "How did it go?" he asked. I looked at him, smiled slightly. "They're scared." He nodded slowly.
Processing. And you, he asked.
I stepped closer, close enough that he could feel my presence, my calm, my control. "I'm just getting started." That's when he realized something. Something dangerous. This wasn't just revenge for me anymore. This was evolution. And evolution doesn't stop. The next move was bigger, riskier, because now I wasn't just exposing them. I was going to make them turn on each other. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. Because destroying someone directly is loud. But making them destroy themselves, that's art. And trust me, I was an artist. Good. Because this is where people usually lose control, and I made sure I didn't. After that dinner, I didn't contact them again. Silence. Not avoidance. Strategy. Because when you disappear after dropping truth, people don't calm down. They spiral. And spiraling minds make mistakes. 3 days. That's how long I waited. 3 days of nothing. No calls, no messages, no reaction. But behind the silence, I was working, mapping their behavior, tracking who called, who, when, how often. Because panic has patterns. And by day 2, the cracks started showing. My brother called me first.
Of course he did.
He was the weakest link. "Hey, what was that about?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I stayed quiet for a second, let the tension grow. "Does it matter?" I said softly. Same line. Different effect. "Yeah, it does," he snapped. Emotion. Good. Emotion clouds judgment. "I thought we were family," he added. I smiled slightly. That's exactly the problem. Silence. He didn't understand. And that was perfect. "Look," he lowered his voice. "Mom and Dad are freaking out." I leaned back, closed my eyes for a moment, enjoyed that sentence. "They should be," I said calmly. And then I gave him just enough. Not truth, not lies, something worse. A half-truth. "There are things you don't know about them," I said. "What things?" he asked quickly. Hooked. I paused again, measured. "Ask them about the accounts," I said quietly, "and why my name is on them." Silence. Confusion.
Fear.
Perfect mix. "I'll call you later," he said suddenly. and hung up. I smiled, because now the infection had spread. Within hours, the house would turn into a battlefield. Questions, accusations, defensive answers. And the most important thing,
doubt.
because once doubt enters a family, it doesn't leave. It multiplies. That night, I didn't need to spy. I didn't need cameras. I knew exactly what was happening. My brother confronting them, my mother denying, my father controlling, but slipping. Because pressure reveals truth. And I had just applied the first layer. The next morning, my mother called. Not calm. Not composed. Desperate. "You need to come home," she said immediately. I stayed silent. "No," I replied. "You don't understand," she started. "I understand enough." I cut in. And then I did something she never expected. I softened my voice. "Amy," I whispered, "are you in trouble?" Silence. That pause, that tiny hesitation, that was everything. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't know if I was a threat or her only way out. And that's where control lives.
I just want to talk, she said.
I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. Then talk. Another pause. And then she said something I had been waiting for. Not on the phone. Of course. Secrets don't travel through wires. Fine, I said. But this time, I let the words sink. We talk on my terms. Silence. And then, okay. Agreement. Submission. Just a little, but enough. I hung up, turned around, and he was there again. Always there. You're pulling them apart, he said quietly. I smiled. They were already broken. He watched me for a moment, longer than usual. You're enjoying this, he added. I didn't deny it, because denial is weakness. I'm understanding it, I corrected. And that's when he said something unexpected. Be careful. I raised an eyebrow. Of them? I asked. He shook his head slowly. Of yourself. For a second, just a second, something inside me paused. But then, I smiled again. Because emotions, even warnings, they're distractions. I'm exactly where I need to be, I said. But deep down, a very small voice whispered something different. And I ignored it. That evening, I chose the location, not the house, not anywhere familiar, a neutral place, because power shifts depending on environment, and I wasn't giving them any advantage. When I walked in, my mother was already there, alone. Good. She stood up quickly, relief flooding her face. You came, she said. I sat down slowly, controlled. Of course, I replied. Because predators don't miss opportunities. She looked different. Smaller. Not physically, mentally. Because fear shrinks people. We made mistakes, she said quickly. I held up my hand.
No. She froze.
Mistakes are accidents, I continued softly. What you did, I leaned forward slightly, was planning. Her eyes filled, but I didn't care. Tears, are just another tool. You don't understand why we did it, she whispered. I tilted my head, almost curious. Then explain. She hesitated. And that hesitation, that was the truth. There were debts, she said finally. Things got complicated. I almost laughed. Complicated? I repeated softly. You signed my life away. Silence. Heavy. And then she said something that changed everything again. It wasn't supposed to go this far. That sentence, that one sentence, that was the crack, because it meant there was more. What does that mean? I asked quietly. She looked down, hands shaking. They were supposed to control you, not involve you. My heartbeat slowed. Not faster. Slower. Because now we were getting close to the real truth. Who is they? I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered something else. They're watching. And just like that, the game changed again. Because this wasn't just about my family anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. And suddenly, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was controlling the game or stepping into something far beyond it. I leaned back slowly, eyes locked on her, mind racing, but face calm. Who are they? I asked again. And this time, she looked up at me, fear in her eyes I had never seen before, and whispered, "The people who own him." Silence. Cold. Heavy. Because now, everything I thought I understood was just the surface. And the deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. Good, because now there was no going back. The people who own him. Those words didn't echo, they settled. Heavy, permanent, dangerous. I didn't react. Not outwardly. Because when the truth becomes bigger than your fear, you don't panic. You calculate. Explain, I said quietly. My mother shook her head immediately. Too fast. No, we shouldn't be talking about this here. I leaned forward slightly, lowered my voice. You already started. Silence. And then she broke. They're not just business people, she whispered. They build systems. My eyes didn't move. What kind of systems? She swallowed hard. People. That word, that single word, it changed everything. Because now, it wasn't just about money, or power, or control. It was about design. They identify, influence, shape, she continued. They take families like ours and turn them into assets. I sat back slowly, letting it sink in. So this wasn't random. This wasn't even personal. This was structure. And me? I asked. Her eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't manipulation. It was regret. You were special, she said softly. I almost smiled. Of course I was. They started tracking you early, your behavior, your responses, your intelligence. Everything I thought was my personality was being measured, optimized, used. They wanted you positioned, she continued, strategically in the right place at the right time. And the marriage? I asked. Her voice broke. That was the final step. Silence. Because now I saw the full picture. I wasn't just a daughter. I wasn't just leverage. I was an investment. Built, shaped, delivered. And suddenly, everything he told me made more sense, but also raised one terrifying question. If he was part of this system, why did he show me the truth? I stood up slowly. My mother reached for my hand. "Please don't go back to him," she whispered. I looked down at her hand, then at her face. And for the first time, I saw her clearly. Not as a mother, not as an enemy, but as something else.
A piece. Just like me.
"You already sent me there," I said softly. And then I pulled my hand away, because emotions, they cloud judgment. And I couldn't afford that anymore. I walked out. But this time, it felt different. Heavier. Because now, I wasn't just playing against my family. I was inside something much bigger. Something designed. When I got back, he was waiting again. But this time, something was off. Subtle. But real. "You were gone longer than expected," he said. I smiled slightly. They had a lot to say. He studied me carefully, longer than usual. "What did they tell you?" he asked. And there it was. The moment.
The test.
Because now, I knew something he didn't expect me to know. Or maybe
He did.
I stepped closer, slow, controlled. They told me about them. His expression didn't change, but his silence did. It deepened. And that told me everything. "You weren't supposed to find out this way," he said finally. Not denial. Confirmation. I tilted my head slightly. "So you admit it?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked something else. "What do you think they want from you?" I smiled. Because now, I had the answer. "They already got it," I said quietly. He watched me, waiting. "Position," I continued. "Access, influence." I stepped even closer, close enough that he couldn't look away. But what they didn't plan, I lowered my voice, was me becoming aware. Silence. And then, for the first time, I saw it. Not control. Not calculation. Respect. "You're ahead of the curve," he said softly. I smiled. "No." I leaned in slightly. "I'm off the map." That's when everything changed. Because now, I wasn't part of their system anymore. I was outside it. And systems don't know how to handle what they can't predict. The next few days, everything accelerated. Messages, movements, decisions. People I had never seen before, watching, waiting. And I understood something critical. They knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. And that meant time was running out. So I made my final move. Not loud. Not dramatic. Precise. I went back to the file. Every page, every detail, every hidden connection. And I found it. The one thing they didn't expect anyone to notice. A clause.
Buried deep.
Overlooked. Because it seemed insignificant. But it wasn't. It was a failsafe. A condition. A line that read, "Subject retains autonomous override upon full cognitive awareness." I smiled. because that line, that one line, was freedom. They built a system so complex, so perfect. They forgot one thing. Awareness breaks control. Always. I closed the file, walked into his office, and placed it in front of him. "It's over," I said calmly. He looked at the page, then at me, and for the first time,
He didn't argue, didn't resist.
he just nodded, because he understood. The system didn't own me anymore, and neither did he. The next part was the easiest. I didn't destroy them. I didn't expose them. I didn't take revenge, because that's what they would expect. Instead, I disappeared. Not completely, just enough. Changed my name, my city, my presence, but not my mind. Never my mind. Because once you understand how the game works, you don't leave it. You just play it better. Months passed. Then one day, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Silence. Then a voice. Familiar. Controlled. "You walked away." I smiled. "No," I said softly. I stepped above. A pause. And then, "We're impressed." I closed my eyes for a second, let the moment settle. Because this was the real ending. Not revenge. Recognition. "I know," I replied. And then I hung up. No fear. No doubt. No attachment. Because the truth is, I was never the victim. I was never the pawn. I was the test. And I passed.